Welcome back to our channel. We're glad to have you here. As we embark on this historical journey together, we remind you of the power you hold as a viewer. Before we dive into the captivating and tumultuous story of the Soviet-Afghan War, we invite you to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support fuels our dedication to bring you in-depth and engaging content. Now sit back, relax, and let's rewind the clock to the late 1970s, a time of major political shifts and upheavals. Stay tuned for our next segment, The Prelude. Our journey begins in the late 1970s, a time of major political shifts and upheavals. This was an era when the world was divided into two ideological blocs, with the Soviet Union representing the Communist Front. Far off in the rugged terrain of Central Asia, Afghanistan was experiencing its own political turmoil. The rise of communist ideology was palpable, and it wasn't long before the Tsar Revolution in 1978 brought a communist government to power. Yet this new government found itself in the midst of widespread unrest and rebellion, struggling to establish its authority. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union, ever vigilant of its strategic interests, was closely watching the unfolding scenario. The instability in Afghanistan was a concern for the Soviets, and they saw a threat in the possibility of a government that could potentially align itself with their Western adversaries. This tension would soon escalate into full-fledged conflict, marking the beginning of the Soviet-Afghan War. The cold winter of December 1979 saw the Soviet Union make its move. In an operation that was as swift as it was brutal, the Soviet forces invaded Afghanistan. The unsuspecting nation found itself under siege, its government under the control of a foreign power. The first casualty was President Hafizullah Amin, who was assassinated during the initial stages of the invasion. The Soviets quickly established the Babrak Karmal regime in a bid to stabilize their new acquisition. Yet, their actions did not go unnoticed. The international community, particularly the United States and Pakistan, were quick to voice their dissent. The United States, in particular, condemned the invasion and began to provide covert support to the Afghan resistance. Pakistan, sharing a border with Afghanistan, found itself dealing with a flood of Afghan refugees and also began supporting the resistance. So, as the new decade dawned, the Soviets found themselves not just ruling a new territory, but also facing a determined and increasingly well-supported resistance. With the stage set, Afghanistan was now a battleground. In the face of occupation, a fierce resistance emerged. The Afghan people, unwilling to tolerate the yoke of Soviet control, rose to challenge the invaders. This resistance was embodied in the Mujahideen, a group of diverse, loosely aligned factions united by their opposition to the Soviet presence. Born from the rugged mountains and desolate deserts, these warriors embodied the spirit of defiance. The Mujahideen were not a conventional army. They didn't march in formation or hold static lines. Instead, they adopted the strategies of guerrilla warfare, striking unpredictably and melting away into the terrain they knew so well. The Mujahideen waged a war of attrition against the Soviets, disrupting supply lines and launching surprise attacks. They turned the rugged landscape into a weapon, using the mountains for cover and the vast deserts to hide their movements. They knew every inch of their homeland, and they used this knowledge to their advantage. But the Mujahideen were not alone in their struggle. They found allies in the unlikeliest of places. The United States, locked in the throes of the Cold War, saw a chance to bleed the Soviets dry. They funneled money, weapons, and training to the Mujahideen through covert operations. Pakistan, sharing a border with Afghanistan, provided refuge and support to the fighters. China too, having its differences with the Soviet Union, offered aid to the Mujahideen. This resistance was not without its triumphs. Key battles such as the Siege of Khost and the Battle of Jaji demonstrated the tenacity and courage of the Mujahideen. These victories, while costly, served as turning points in the war. They showed the world that the Mujahideen were not just a ragtag band of rebels, they were a formidable force capable of standing up to one of the world's superpowers. Despite facing a superpower, the Mujahideen held their ground. Their resistance was a testament to the indomitable spirit of the Afghan people, a spirit that refused to bow to foreign domination. This was not just a war of guns and bombs, but a war of wills. And in this war, the Mujahideen proved they were not to be underestimated. By the late 1980s, the winds of change were blowing once again. The Soviet Union, once a superpower that commanded international respect, was on the brink of disintegration. Internal economic and political pressures were reaching a boiling point, and the costly war in Afghanistan was draining the Soviet Union's resources. Meanwhile, the international community was pushing for peace. The Geneva Accords, signed in April 1988, marked a significant turning point. These accords, brokered by the United Nations, called for the withdrawal of Soviet troops from Afghanistan and the establishment of a neutral Afghan state. By February 1989, the last Soviet soldier left Afghan soil, marking the end of a brutal and costly conflict. The impact of this war was far-reaching. For the Soviet Union, their involvement in Afghanistan was seen as a major factor in their eventual collapse. The economic strain, loss of life, and international condemnation proved too much to bear. For Afghanistan, the war left the country in ruins. Infrastructure was decimated, countless lives were lost, and the societal fabric was torn apart. The withdrawal of Soviet troops created a power vacuum, leading to further conflict and instability. The end of the war, however, was not the end of strife for Afghanistan. In the war's wake, Afghanistan was left in ruins. The Soviet-Afghan War, a brutal contest of power and ideology, left an indelible mark on the landscape of Afghanistan. Politically, the war created a power vacuum, destabilizing the region and setting the stage for the rise of the Taliban. This militant group capitalized on the chaos, seizing control and imposing a harsh regime that would last for years. Socially, the war left deep scars on the Afghan people. Families were torn apart, communities were shredded, and a generation grew up knowing nothing but conflict. The cultural fabric of the nation was severely damaged, a loss felt deeply by its people. Decades later, these wounds are still healing. Economically, the war was a disaster. Infrastructure was decimated, industries were crippled, and the economy was sent into a tailspin. The cost of rebuilding was astronomical, and the nation was left shouldering a burden it could ill afford. The effects of this economic devastation are still felt today, and yet, the war also set the stage for future conflicts in the region. The instability and discontent it fostered would become a breeding ground for further unrest and violence. The echoes of this war can still be heard in the ongoing struggles of Afghanistan. Thus concludes the saga of the Soviet-Afghan War, a chapter that forever changed the course of history. Let's take a moment to reflect on what we've learned. The Soviet-Afghan War, a saga of invasion, resistance, withdrawal, and aftermath, leaves an indelible mark on world history. Its ripple effects continue to shape global dynamics. In understanding our past, we can better navigate our present and future. Thank you for joining us on this historical journey.